And I'll never forget, I looked at him, Jack, and I said, America doesn't understand. I believe it is going to take a seminal event, probably in this country, where hundreds, if not thousands, die before Americans realize we are at war with this guy, meaning bin Laden. And he said, well, we're doing our best to make sure that doesn't happen. And we got up, we walked out of his office. We were going to look at some overhead satellite imagery of what now is commonly known, but back then was very closely guarded, which was Tarnak Farms, the major training camp for Al-Qaeda operatives. And 20 minutes after I said that, the first plane hit the North Tower.
When we did that conversation on stage as part of the targeted book tour, you were so kind enough to do that. I wanted to just interview you the whole time. I just wanted to talk to you the whole time. I mean, what an amazing experience you've had throughout your entire life. Of course, the Cole, everything you've done before, since. I want to talk to you about all of that today. And I really want to encourage everyone to get this, to get Front Burner, because it honors those who sacrificed their lives, those who were wounded, and those who aren't listed as wounded, but are for sure still dealing with the emotional trauma of that day and the days that followed. So an incredible insight right here on not only on the attack itself, but on leadership and on the political side of things too, both military side and the actual politics in Washington. So incredibly fascinating. But I think the best way to start, let me read this from the beginning. There's a couple things that I want to read throughout, but I'll set the tone here, and then let's hop in. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
All right, here we go. First and foremost, a ship is a reflection of its crew. In a singular moment in time, USS Cole and its crew became part of the Navy's history and long heritage of unswerving devotion to our nation and the freedom of its citizens. The war on terror started with us. All the sailors of the USS Cole chose a life of consequence in service to the nation and are heroes for what they endured that horrific day and in the weeks that followed. Those who lost their lives will always be remembered in our thoughts and prayers. It is my honor to have been given the unique and humbling opportunity to command the officers and crew of the USS Cole. Man. So let's before we get to that day, let's do the run up to that day. Early in life, did you know you were going to go into military service? And I know you received appointments both to Annapolis and West Point. How did you choose Annapolis, and what was the lead up to that day of decision?
Well, Jack, in full disclosure, I actually wanted to go Air Force and the Air Force Academy because I wanted to fly. I had family that lived in Colorado Springs, so it made perfect sense. But I ended up with those two appointments, and the Navy, what we call blue and gold officer, who does all the recruiting to go to the academy, got to me first and said, look, if you want to do this Army thing, we have the Marine Corps. You can do anything you want there. But if you choose to go Army, you just have to remember one thing. Your home is where you dig it. And so that's how I ended up deciding to go to the Naval Academy. I think like a lot of young folks coming out of high school, I had no clue what I was getting into. I stood in that center courtyard at the Naval Academy with a fresh haircut, new uniform, raised my right hand and swore that oath that all of us do, but without any real idea. I had no one in my family on either my mom or dad's side that had served in the military, short of my great-grandfather on my dad's side, who fought in the trenches for Germany in World War I. So it was somewhat of a totally unique experience, not just for me, but for the family as well, because we had no reference point rippling out both sides. Nobody had ever served just because of the timing between wars, post-Korea, pre-Vietnam. And so that's how I ended up joining.
When you look back on that Annapolis experience, what are your memories? Do you remember that plebe summer, or do you block that part out, or what do you remember about your 4 years at the academy?
For me, that 4 years was a struggle. I'll be honest with you. I was not as mature and focused. And while I came out of high school, had done well, gotten the appointment, when I arrived there, I was behind a lot of my classmates. I had had no calculus, for example, which is fairly common these days in high school curriculums. So I literally struggled for all 4 years there. I would say that the one word that for me defined my time and why I ultimately would graduate from the Naval Academy is perseverance. I just put my head down and I just kept at it. Struggled through my grades. As I like to put it, I graduated in the top 90% of my class, but I eventually got through it. And to me, that was that really for me marked a seminal moment where I could sit there and now say, okay, I have finished with this. And what everyone was telling us is when you go out, you're going to start with a clean slate. So whatever you decide to do in the fleet, what you've done here for the past 4 years, no one cares what your grades are. They're going to care about what you do when you get aboard that ship and you're now in charge of people, spaces, and equipment, and you start truly building your life and your career.
Yeah. Did you, how many summer cruises do you do at the academy? Do you do one big one, or do you do one each summer? How does that work?
Well, normally they have what's called a youngster cruise. So in your second year there, when you're a sophomore, or right after your plebe year, between your first and second year, you have youngster cruise. And that's where in those days you went aboard a ship and you were with the enlisted. For me, I was on the USS Forrestal, the aircraft carrier. I was in the electrical division or E division berthing. And that's where I was for the full 3.5 weeks that I was on a deployment. Actually met the ship in the Mediterranean and sailed with them both underway and in port. And then the next deployment that you get is between your junior and senior years. So it's called first class cruise. And that one, I was on an LPD, which was an amphibious transport dock. And that was unique in that we got underway from Norfolk, Virginia, and we're actually supporting the Mariel Harbor boat lift, which was when Castro was turning everyone loose from his country to say, if you don't want to be here, get out. So we also inherited a lot of the folks that came out of jails, a lot of the mental institutions. But Jack, that was for me one of the most powerful moments in the world, because all these rickety boats that we would pick up these Cubans from, we would load them onto an LCU landing craft. It would come in the well deck of that ship. It would then lift up, dry out. They would drop it. These men and women would walk up and they would sit in their chairs waiting to be processed to go up to the flight deck and take a helicopter into initially Key West and then other settlement centers. And they would stare at this huge American flag. And as they're waiting, tears would be streaming down their face because they knew for the first time in their lives, they were being given an opportunity to see, taste, and now live freedom.
Wow. On that first cruise with the Forrestal, or even the second one, did you know that you made the right choice? Were you all in, or did you question your life choices and say, "Oh my gosh, what am I in for here?"
Well, when I was at the Naval Academy, I spent 4 years almost wanting to be a Marine. And it literally wasn't until the morning of service selection that I woke up and said, nope, that's not what you're going to do. You're going to pick a ship. I can't explain it. I don't know why. I just know it put me on that path that, would eventually lead to USS Cole. But for me, I would graduate from the Naval Academy. I would go to the division officer course up in Newport, Rhode Island. I would be there for 18 weeks. I had no follow-on school. So when I graduated, I was so excited to get to my first ship, USS Fairfax County, a tank landing ship that was in the shipyard in Chester, Pennsylvania, that I graduated on the 3rd of December, and I reported aboard my first ship the next morning.
Wow.
I wanted to begin that journey.
Yeah. Wow. What time frame were you in Newport? I was just there in the late fall and hit a beautiful week to be in Newport. It was awesome. I know it's not always like that because I had to go there once when I was in the Navy, and it was in January. It was in January. Luckily, like, duck season was open, so I hit that on the weekends. But it was beautiful a couple weeks ago. Oh my gosh! When were you there for those 18? I'm sure you've been in and out of there a few times since.
No, I was there for essentially from the end of August through December.
Okay.
So for those 18 weeks. So, I mean, there is nothing more pleasurable than going and sitting out on the grass at the inn at Castle Hill or running along some of those seaside runs that are up there. I mean, it's just Newport is absolutely a beautiful town. And when you look at the mansions there that were built by the real wealthy people in our country that truly founded it, the Carnegies, the Pierpont, J.P. Morgan, all those guys, just those mansions that are now historic buildings are just stunning. So Newport's a fun town, lot to see and do there.
Yeah, a little different when I was there in January. I think they closed down. They must have a shoulder season, or they did back when I was there, where things were kind of closed down. Because a couple of weeks ago, it was not closed down, and it was so beautiful. Everything was still hopping. All the restaurants were open. It was beautiful. What year did you graduate the academy?
1981.
1981. So is it your first ship that gives you your essentially first taste of that taste is not the right word. Your first experience with international terrorism, going into Lebanon? The new 1911X from Sig Sauer, a balance of classic 1911 engineering and style with modern upgrades, including an ultra-low profile direct mount optic capability designed with the new Romeo X red dot optic, X-ray 3 day-night sights for extreme sight picture visibility, an adjustable flat blade trigger and custom G10 grip panels from LOK Grips. Designed with a full 1913 rail and stainless steel frame with undercut trigger guard. An extended ambidextrous manual safety and slide stop. Chambered in classic 45 ACP. Sig Sauer 1911X. Classic design meets modern innovation. Introducing the new Jack-Car BCM Mod 4 grip. Reduced angle for improved ergonomics and trigger control. New aggressive grip texture to maximize traction. Extended forward tang to close the gap between the trigger guard and pistol grip. High-rise beaver tail style backstrap. Open bottom to minimize weight. Includes mounting hardware for mil-spec lower receivers. Manufactured in the USA from high-quality impact-resistant polymers. Go to BravoCompanyUSA.com and get yours today.
It really was. Our first deployment was to Beirut, Lebanon. We were going to be supporting the artillery battery that was on a hill that sat above the international airport. And we had the Marines on board the ship. And that's where you really, I've always had a like for foreign affairs, foreign policy, national security policy. And so now for the first time in my life, I'm actually watching how that interface works between what you were back then reading on the front page of the Washington Post, which was a premier paper, and now the actual application of U.S. power, because the Marines that were there were part of the multinational peacekeeping force. We arrived there in January of 1983. We essentially sailed from Norfolk, Virginia, down to Morehead City, picked up our Marines in the artillery battery, and then we sailed straight for 3.5 weeks, anchored off the coast of Beirut, offloaded them, and then it was doing patrols every night around the ships of the amphibious readiness group, or ARG, and we were supporting the Marine Amphibious Unit back then. It was a MAU then, and it's a MU now, a Marine Expeditionary Unit. And during that time, we had a chance to, occasionally get an opportunity to go downtown. So I went down for a formal dinner that was held. So I spent the night in the Beirut barracks. And then about several weeks later, I had the opportunity to actually go downtown again. We went to the U.S. Embassy, exchanged money, took a tour downtown of Martyr Square. We went up to this beautiful little town just north of Beirut called Jounieh. And then it was back out to the ship. And literally just a few days after I had been in the embassy, it was hit. car bomb goes off, takes out the center section, kills 17 Americans in that attack. And then obviously from your book, Beirut, which really chronicles everything in the buildup and the attack on the Beirut barracks bombing that fall in October.
What did it feel like to be there in early April? Did you sense that things were spiraling? What did it feel like to walk downtown? What did it feel? What did you feel from interacting with the people that you did, and then with the embassy staff or leadership team? What was that? What sense did you have when you left Beirut from your experience there?
Everything seemed normal. Yeah. There was nothing untoward. We were there with as I mentioned, the multinational peacekeeping force. The French had a large contingent. Israel had invaded Lebanon at that point in time. But we would sit offshore at night and we would watch the different militias shooting at each other across the hill. And sometimes it would go on for, 1-2 hours. And then the Israelis would get tired of it and you'd watch the tanks roll out. They would park themselves and you'd see them point in both directions. And they'd start lobbing shells from the tanks into the hills. And then everyone would calm down for the night and the tanks would roll back down to the Israeli encampment and all would be quiet for the rest of the evening. So it was a very surreal and bizarre thing, but there was nothing to indicate danger to Americans. We were there trying to get the country stabilized to a point that a government could come back in. It was a very blended country in Lebanon because you had Christians, you had Jews, you had a lot of Muslims there. And they had all gotten along for a large period of time, but the Civil War had broken out, I believe, in 1975, and the country was just being torn apart by sectarian violence. What we were there to try and do with this multinational force was try and just get things stable to a point that people felt that a central government could be formed that would look out for everybody's interests and that people would once again feel safe. Beirut at the time or before the Civil War had been considered the Paris of the Middle East. And we were just trying to create opportunity for that beautiful country to once again be stable and to live in peace, even though there were obviously those divisions that were just under the surface.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable how many different terrorist events you are close to as you go throughout your time in the Navy leading up to the USS Cole, and then getting to spend time with you outside Annapolis a little bit ago. Your deep understanding of foreign policy, international relations certainly shine through in every sentence that you uttered up there on stage. That's why I wanted to keep asking you questions, and I'm so glad we're doing this now. But you also lost a friend on October 23rd in the Marine Beirut barracks and headquarters bombing, an Annapolis classmate, I believe.
I did. First Lieutenant Dave Nairn, who went Marine Corps. He and I used to do military parachute jumping at the Naval Academy dairy farm back in the day. I'd gotten my jump master certificate and used to tap him out of the reserve Hueys coming out of Fort Meade. And so, we were good friends and I knew him. And then, I had another Academy classmate that was there that survived, Bob Dixon. And so it was a very unique environment. And having spent the night in the barracks, I could see how it had pancaked down the way it did and killed so many so quickly. But that truck that was transporting those explosives, as that was built and designed to do exactly what it did, and it was brutally effective.
Yeah. And then where were you in October of 1985 when the Achille Laurel was hijacked?
Well, after I finished with Fairfax County back in those days, because of the Reagan buildup, you did 36 months as a first division officer tour, and then you went back to sea for another 18 plus months. I was actually on USS Yorktown, which is an Aegis guided missile cruiser. And really, our mission was to truly demonstrate the power of the Aegis weapon system, that phased array radar that is now commonplace on U.S. Navy ships. And a lot of other navies throughout the world have also adopted that technology. But at that time, it was new. And at the time, we were operating in the Mediterranean. Obviously, Palestinian terrorists got on board the Achille Lauro, which was a cruise ship. They killed one person, Leon Klinghoffer, who was in a wheelchair, an innocent civilian, threw his body in the wheelchair over the side of the ship. Fortunately, it would later be recovered, but we knew that the terrorists were hiding out in Egypt at the time. They were trying to get out of Egypt to Tunisia, where the Palestinians had been thrown out of Israel and were now there waiting to kind of reestablish themselves back into Israel at some point in what they considered their land. And at the time, we were getting ready for a port visit, and we were heading up to Taranto, Italy. And we literally got a phone call, or not a phone call, a radio message that came over, a clear voice. And it from Sixth Fleet, it was USS Yorktown, proceed south at best speed, rendezvous with Saratoga, further direction to follow. Sixth Fleet out. And away we went. Met up with the Saratoga, who was tearing across the Eastern Mediterranean because we had gotten intelligence at the time that the terrorists were going to board a 737 in commercial colors, take off out of Egypt and head to Tunisia. And our job was to launch F-14s and be able to do that. At the time, I was standing the watch as the Force Air Warfare Coordinator for the battle group. So we actually watched as Saratoga initially launched the E-2 Hawkeye aircraft, which have that big spinning radome on top. That because they're prop driven, so they need a little more time to get out where they need to keep the air picture. And then we would watch the F-14s go when we controlled them all the way out until virtually the intercept. When we handed it off to E-2 to actually do it, they did that intercept. Initially, the aircraft denied it. Let's just say the F-14s convinced them that they knew who was aboard. They would fly to Sigonella, Italy. Unfortunately, they told them when you land, turn right. And during that time between when we went after them and we captured them, the winds had shifted. So when they land, the base at Sigonella was a split base, half Italian, half U.S. They went to the Italian side. The Italian government, the Praxi government at the time, was very weak, and they subsequently freed every single one of the terrorists, and they did not oversee justice.
Yeah, I think we had some naval special warfare assets on the ground there at the time that didn't get to do what they were trained up to do. And then we have December 1985, Rome and Vienna. Where are you for those?
We had made that. We're still on deployment with Yorktown. And at that time, we were moored in Naples, Italy. A lot of the families knew we were going to probably be there for about a 8 or 9 day period. So some of the families wanted to come over. We had 2 chief petty officers that had actually gone up to Rome, were in the airport to pick up their wives when terrorist attacks with machine guns and hand grenades. They were there, heard the explosions. They just grabbed their wives and said, "We're out of here." They jumped into cab and they said, "Drive. We're under attack. Just drive." And they cleared out of that area. And fortunately, none of them were hurt. But once again, it was close. And that's where, as soon as they got back and we got word that that the airport had been attacked in Rome, all these were being tied back to Libya at the time with Gaddafi. While we stayed in port for the entire time through Christmas, we also knew that we were getting underway. And at that point, that's when you really saw from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Sixth Fleet at the time, who was Admiral Kelso, who would later become the Chief of Naval Operations, planning for the attacks on Libya would actually commence in earnest. And we began to fly those types of missions, practicing for how we were going to deal with the missiles we knew were going to be shot at our aircraft. At that point, Gaddafi had essentially drawn a line at 32 degrees, 30 minutes north, where essentially the entire Gulf of Sidra, he said, was now Libyan territorial waters, which means it went not just the 12 miles, which defines every nation, but he said the entire thing was. And we were not about to brook that. And so consequently, we would end up with initially 2 carrier battle groups, the USS Saratoga and the Coral Sea. We would later be joined by the USS America. So you had 3 carrier battle groups at one time operating in the Gulf of Sidra to stare down and reestablish freedom of navigation in these claimed territorial waters. But there was always an eye toward what we were going to do. And then unfortunately, we would be detached to head home. We'd been on deployment for 7 months at that point. It was going to take a couple weeks to get back to the United States. And it was during the transit back that the attacks on the Beirut or the Berlin disco occurred. And that's when President Reagan said enough. And that's when they literally brought in B-1s coming out of Great Britain along with aircraft. And they went downtown and they were on the hunt for Gaddafi and missed.
Yeah, and those attacks were April 5th, 1986. And it's incredible that you were involved or had a touch point with all of these different attacks during the 80s that as a kid, when I'm 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, I'm seeing on the cover of our Time and Newsweek that would come through our house and sit on our dinner table, and then the covers of our newspapers that would come daily. And as a kid, I knew, for some reason, I knew that my generation's war would have some touch point with terrorism. And from my earliest days, I was reading all of those things, and you were involved in all of them.
Well, Jack, what I think, unfortunately, what it shows is if you go all the way back, and those were really touchstones in my career where I was able to see how we as a nation were unwilling to truly address the threat. And it was because of those actions. I mean, look, I begrudge no one when it comes to the choices of what they want to make in life. But when you are dealing with the safety of a nation and you have people who represent a threat, you have to work with our allies and, if necessary, by ourselves to eliminate that threat. And you heard me. I'll make the argument then as I make today, and that is solve the problem, not the symptom. And that means that while you can go after all these individual terrorist groups, even leading up to what we're seeing in the world today, those are symptoms. Eventually, you're going to have to face down the countries that are quite literally giving these terrorist groups, first and foremost, financing. That then allows them to recruit, equip, train, plan, and conduct terrorist operations around the world. Unless you hit that source with those nations, you are never going to solve the problem of terrorism for our country or anyone else in the world.
After our response from the April 1986 attacks, was that the last time that we responded in any significant way to an act of terrorism up until September 11th?
In many ways, it was. You would end up having World Trade Center 1. But, up until that point, we had looked at terrorist acts as criminal acts. We never viewed them in the context of an armed conflict or a war. And so the mindset was much different. So World Trade Center 1, investigated by the FBI. Khobar Towers, investigated by the FBI. And that was in 1996. The October 1998 attacks on the embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya. The FBI would investigate that, and ultimately the attack on USS Cole. Many of the FBI agents that had investigated both World Trade Center 1 and the embassy bombings in East Africa were also on board USS Cole investigating. It was a criminal act. Nobody thought that. When you attack buildings and embassies, those are things that house and represent U.S. interests. The difference with Cole is when you attack a warship, that's something that defends our interests around the world. And when you try to take away a nation's ability to defend itself, it is an act of war, and it should have been treated as such, and it wasn't, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think Kenya and Tanzania, was that August of 98?
October.
It was October. And I remember those two, and I remember thinking, man, I was a brand new guy at my SEAL team. I was the intelligence rep for the platoon, and I remember thinking, why are we still not doing anything in response to these attacks that are clearly acts of war? I've been studying these things since I was a little kid, since I was that 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid reading the Time and Newsweek as they came across our kitchen table there. What did you do between then and in 1986 and then taking command of the USS Cole?
So when I would actually do the full 21 months on board Yorktown as the communications officer and the combat information center officer. And then I went off to a Navy postgraduate school. My commanding officer at that time was kind enough to get me orders despite my grades. And so I went out there and I kind of looked at it and, okay, this is your opportunity to prove that you're not as dumb as you think you are. and I overloaded and was actually almost got 2 degrees out of there. I was typically pulling around 18 to 20 hours during a master's program. So I got one in systems engineering for joint command control and communications, and the other one, as you would expect, was in national security affairs. So just came shy, but I would have stayed an extra semester to get that second degree, but I was given an incredible opportunity, and I became the commissioning operations officer on USS Arleigh, which is the Navy's first Aegis class guided missile destroyer, and literally built that ship from the keel up. Knew every one of the systems on board, knew how it operated, knew how to drive it as the officer of the deck and conning officer, knew how to fight that ship as the operations officer. And so I did that for 2+ years, actually 3.5 if you counted all the time in pre-commissioning. I would roll off of there and go to the Army's Command and General Staff College in 1993 and did that for a year till 1994. Then went out to be executive officer on USS Shiloh out of San Diego. Met the ship on deployment, brought it back from deployment, worked the whole inter-deployment training cycle between the time one deployment ended and the next one started, stood on the pier, waved goodbye to the ship when they started their deployment, and wished them well. And from there, I would get orders to go be the administrative aide to the Secretary of the Navy. So now I'm not only getting educated, but now I'm going to get to see how Washington works, but initially from the civilian side of the fence. Because Secretary of the Navy, that's the civilian. I mean, one of the great cornerstones of our democracy is the fact that, our republic is the fact that we have civilian control of the military. And so I actually got to watch how he interfaced both in Secretary Dalton and Secretary Danzig, and how they worked with the Chief of Naval Operations, how they interfaced with Congress up on the Hill, and get to see that. My job as the administrative aide was everything that came across the Secretary's desk. Unless it was a legal matter, I was the one that proofed it. So congressmen writing letters and why is the Navy doing this or not doing that, or a constituent writing, I was the one that proofed every one of those letters to make sure they were written. And that's where I actually got very good at writing, at English, because everything the secretary signs out represents the United States Navy. So perfection can't be a goal. It has to be a standard. And that proved a little frustrating for some people, but nonetheless, that's where you really learn that art as you have well proven yourself how to write and write well and write succinctly to get your point across. And after doing that, I actually received orders to commission the next generation design of guided missile destroyers. It was DDG 79. So I'd gone from 51 to 79 now, USS Oscar Austin. And then those orders would be changed when the secretary changed out between Secretaries Dalton going to Secretary Danzig. They were canceled. I would get the next set of orders to another destroyer. And unfortunately, I got a call, and I had a Naval Academy classmate going to a ship, but he had a daughter, unfortunately, that was terminally ill with cancer. And I was asked, would I be willing to swap ships? And I'm talking to my detailer saying, why did you even make this call? Those orders should have been in the air before you even did it. The answer is, of course, yes. So that's how Cole was actually my third set of orders to command a ship.
Wow. That's incredible. And the one thing I wish I'd gotten to do in the Navy, or actually there's two things. I got pretty fortunate, especially as an officer, being enlisted, then an officer, and then hitting Iraq and Afghanistan and being in the right places at the right times. But I wanted to go to Naval Postgrad School after my last deployment, leading guys. It would be my last one, tactically maneuvering guys on the battlefield. And then it was time to go on to staff and ops and XO and CO and that sort of thing, which wasn't really in my blood. But going to postgrad school for that national security studies degree with that, I think, an emphasis in special operations or whatever they had up there in terrorism. I really wanted to do that. But by that point, we had an exceptional family member, category 5, I think it was called, where they don't move you.
Right.
I knew I was getting out. I knew it was time to get out and take care of my family. So
yeah, and that comes up. I mean, you've got to be near a major, major medical treatment facility, which typically is either going to be DC, Norfolk, or San Diego. And look, I think a lot of people, we kind of get it in the military. Some unfortunately don't, but most of us do. That being in the military It's an honor and a privilege, but it is not a job for life, nor is it designed to be. And eventually you get that signal or you make that determination based upon your life circumstances, and you make the decision to get out. And you try to do that with the best timing and under the best circumstances that are going to leverage your skill set to be able to go on to the next chapter in your life and figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life. And at that point, you're given the opportunity of a lifetime again to write what you want to do. I mean, a lot of folks go into the defense industry. I chose not to do that. So what have you done in life that you want to go do again? Or what have you done in life that you want to go learn about? Get a real estate license, get a teaching certificate. And I chose to try in that world where I got on and do, inspirational leadership speaking, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah. No. Well said. The other one that I wanted to do is, and I was always focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. Things had kicked off and got really busy for a while there, obviously in those two places. But I would have loved to have gone to Israel and at least observed some of the Flotilla 13 training, selection, how they do some of their operations, because regionally they were so good. And that's the Israeli version for those listening or watching of our Navy SEALs. So I would have liked to have done that as well. So those are the two things. But, hey, what can you do? It's a pretty good run otherwise. What does it feel like to take command of a ship? And did it feel like what you thought it would after all those years of essentially preparation for taking that step?
It is literally having the weight of that accountability suddenly rest on your shoulders because you stand on the flight deck of the ship like I did, and you get to say the three greatest words of your career. I relieve you. And with those three simple words, you now get to carry out a centuries-old, time-honored tradition. And in my case, I assume total accountability for a $1+ billion national asset, the lives of almost 300 sailors. I was part of the George Washington Aircraft Carrier Battle Group. I had about 1 year to get that ship ready for deployment. The crew had my command philosophy. They had my goals and expectations. And now it was going to be up to me to really take command, take charge, set the bar, and now begin to shape that crew to be ready to leave our home port of Norfolk, Virginia, and if necessary, be ready to sail in harm's way. And if you get into combat, you want to be able to fight and win at the end of the day, and hopefully bring everyone home back alive.
Yeah. And you look like you could step up right now, 25 years later, and do that exact same thing, step aboard a ship and take command and just lead that thing into battle. It's remarkable. Lead up to the attack. Why were you there? What were you doing in Yemen? And what got you to that time and place during that workup and then deployment?
Well, during the year, Jack, when we were getting ready for deployment, our mission was going to be what was called VBSS, or Visit Board Search and Seizure Operations.
Oh, yes,
we were going to leave Norfolk, cross the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, go to the North Arabian Gulf, and force United Nations sanctions against the country of Iraq. We were essentially going to be stopping ships entering or leaving Iraqi waters and inspecting them. Were they carrying any illicit cargo? Were they carrying any illicit oil? All that we were doing. We were nowhere near trained where they are today. Mm-hmm. But that was the mission we trained for. But there was another circumstance. In that year that we were getting ready, I literally had built up, along with the previous CO who gave me a great training program. I had the best Tomahawk land attack missile team on the East Coast of the United States. Because of that, I was going to be loaded out with double the normal load of Tomahawks on board the ship rather than surface-to-air missiles or anti-submarine rockets. And so consequently, because of rotation schedules in and out of the Middle East, we were held back 6 weeks. So the battle group with George Washington, they all leave at the end of June. 6 weeks later, we would deploy in August, and we would cross the Atlantic, go into the Mediterranean. We would operate there for 4 weeks. As I like to put it, we suffered miserably for 4 weeks. through Barcelona, Spain, Villafranche, France, Valletta, Malta, Koper, Slovenia. I mean, Jack, you know as well as I do, we still have the best tagline in the world. Join the Navy, see the world. Now, my perspective of a ship might be a little bit different from what the special warfare community experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, but you literally get to go see the world. And we're very proud of the fact that we go out there, and I had these sailors not only representing USS Cole, but our nation as well. And they did a phenomenal job. They saw bullfights, they saw the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, St. Paul Shipwreck Cathedral, Venice, Italy. I mean, we did everything, but there was that split second where we had operational commitments right after our last port visit in Koper, where we would operate in the Adriatic. And there was that guy Milosevic, ethnic cleansing in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Serbia, everything going on there. And we were ready to launch Tomahawks on less than an hour notice at times. Fortunately, we never had to do that, and eventually we would head toward the Middle East, and that's where we would have to go at double the normal speed. So instead of a leisurely 11-knot transit, which is about 12, 13 miles an hour, we'd go through the Suez Canal on the 9th of October, down the Red Sea through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, rounded the corner, and we'd be off this port called Aden, Yemen at about 2:30 in the morning on the 12th of October to refuel the ship, and we were below 50% fuel. So they were very anxious to get us into a port, get us refueled, and get us back, because the next day we were going to do turnover with two other ships in our destroyer squadron, USS Donald Cook and USS Guided Missile Frigate. And then we were going to get underway, go to the Strait of Hormuz, pull into Bahrain, get our briefings, and then head to the North Arabian Gulf. So we would literally pull in because there were no oilers in the area. The closest oiler was 1,000 miles away. We'd gone from 4,000 ships in World War II to 600 ships in the Reagan buildup to that morning, 315 ships. The closest oiler was 1,000 miles away. So that's how we came to be in Aden, Yemen, the morning of October 12th.
Wow. And what do you remember about that day beforehand?
Beautiful. Beautiful day. We had arrived early. We're off the port. We weren't scheduled to go in till about 8 o'clock. We started pressing them, just like coming in early today for the podcast. It was, we're about 7:30. We're kind of saying, hey, the sooner we get in, taking on 250,000 gallons of fuel and what we were expecting to be a 300 to 500 gallon per minute refueling rate at the pier out in the middle of the harbor, the sooner I can get back out to sea where Navy ships feel safe. But we would eventually start heading into the port around 8:30 that morning. We would get alongside the pier, and then it was back and forth, and the tugs were very sloppy. They were doing a difficult time. The line handlers on the pier were not doing a good job. So it took us about an hour to settle alongside the pier and finally get the ship tied up. And we had then one line off the bow going to a mooring buoy, one line off the stern going to a mooring buoy. We shut down the four main engines that power the two shafts. We left two of our three gas turbine generators running that were providing 2,500 kilowatts of power each, and started the import refueling checklist. And, at that point, we expected a routine refueling operation, being there 6 to 8 hours. And so it was kind of settle in for the day, get all the security measures that we thought were appropriate for our geographic circumstances into place, and then let's get the ship refueled and let's get out of here.
And there was some discussion about getting the garbage off the ship. What was that all about?
That morning when we pulled in, a couple extra things happened. Number one, we had asked three things from the embassy: refuel the ship. Because we were going to be in there 6 to 8 hours, we had to ask for a sewage barge to come out because the tanks wouldn't hold for that period of time. They only last, 3-4 hours. So we were going to be there double that. And that sewage barge came out and was off the stern of the ship. And we were pumping sewage into that. And then we were taking fresh water from the pier so we didn't have to make it out of the harbor water. But the logistics agent for the port made a very kind offer and said, hey, look, every ship that's pulled in typically has gotten garbage barges. I provide 3 of them for $150, and no questions asked. We will take off all your trash, all your plastic, and all your hazmat that you can't dump at sea. I initially declined that. The supply officer got reinforcements to convince me it was good. And my XO, comes up and plays the logic game. Hey, Captain, it's $1 billion ship with a multi-million-dollar budget. I guarantee you in the next 353 days, we'll get $150 worth of budget efficiencies. And I said, fine. Supply officer went out. 2 boats had come across, and we started dumping all that trash, plastic, and hazmat into the 2 boats. And then they left and crossed the harbor. And what we didn't know is that when they crossed the harbor, they would dump trash, and then one would come back out to the ship kind of playing cleanup. And that's when a 3rd boat came out, slowed, turned by the bow, young fireman up on the forecastle to make sure we didn't spill fuel. Fireman Raymond Mooney saw it go by, and he saw it go down to the middle of the ship. He heard it thump alongside, same spot where the garbage barge had been. What we didn't know is that Al-Qaeda had been there for a year. From the safe house, they had watched when Navy ships pull in, what pier they moored to, what side they moored to, what boats came out, what path they followed. And contrary to what you read in a lot of press reports, that it was a Zodiac boat that raced across the harbor and rammed the side of the ship, that 3rd garbage barge looked just like the other garbage barges. It had been brought in from Saudi Arabia, 24-foot, fiberglass, center console, outboard motor. The 2 guys in it, as they went by, Fireman Mooney actually even stood up and began to wave at not only him, but some of the security guys came to the side of the ship, bumped, drifted out about 5 feet, and then detonated. And Fireman Mooney got a face full of shrapnel. He'd be evacuated. He'd survived when the FBI and NCIS interviewed him at Portsmouth Naval Hospital several days later, as it had gone by. What he had thought to himself was, boy, that sure is awful clean for a garbage barge. Yeah. And that was the only untoward. We were operating under peacetime rules of engagement, which mean that something would have had to have indicated hostile intent, like aiming a gun, or a hostile act, like shooting us with a gun. They had attempted an attack 9 months before us at the USS The Sullivans, moored at that same pier, but the boat had been overloaded, choppy seas, it had sunk. Al-Qaeda had panicked, left town, came back a day later. They recovered the vehicle and a Isuzu truck. They recovered the trailer. They recovered the boat. They recovered the explosives. They tested the explosives in the desert. The explosives, in fact, had been bought. Talk about a tie-in to 9/11. Ben Attash, Khalad, had bought the explosives for the attack on USS Cole, and he would subsequently be involved in the planning for 9/11. And they tested it, and that they had moved to a new safe house after that failure and built the explosives into the boat. So as it went by, it wasn't like the back of a Ryder truck full of blue barrels approaching the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. There was nothing to indicate that it was a waterborne IED that we had never trained for, never practiced against, and never experienced in our Navy.
And no one knew that Al-Qaeda had this failure all those months earlier.
No.
When they came back, actually, I think they had to kind of snoop around a bit and see, hey, are people onto us? And nothing was any different from what I've read. And so that's when they recover all the equipment. They move into the safe house. They continue observing and learn from the lessons of the failed attack, and then prep for USS Cole. Where were you when the bomb went off?
I was in my cabin in the forward starboard superstructure. So when you look at the side of the ship, you've got those 2 large superstructure areas. In the starboard side, or right side, forward, up a couple decks, that's where the captain's cabin is, right below the phased array radar on the starboard forward side. And I was sitting at my cabin doing routine paperwork at a desk that morning when the blast went off.
What did you feel physically when that happened?
As I was sitting there at 11:18, it was initially a thunderous explosion. You could feel all 505 feet and 8,400 tons of destroyer was violently thrust up into the right. You could literally feel the ship bow in the middle sideways, bow underneath. And as we were carried up toward the pier, We just kind of rotated and settled back down in the water. We rocked violently from side to side, surged fore and aft on the mooring lines. Power had failed almost immediately, so it was dark. Emergency lights came on. I had come in the brace position, grabbing the underside of my desk as everything popped up and slammed back down. And once the ship stopped moving to a point that I could let go, I went to the door of my cabin. And there's a passageway that runs from the starboard to the port side. And on the far end of that passageway is the wardroom where all the officers eat. But as I look down that passageway, there's one emergency light by my door, one halfway down the passageway, and this gray cloud comes around the corner. It rolled toward me and then silently washed over me. I could smell the dust. I could smell the fuel, but there was also this acrid metallic tang that settled in the back of my mouth and didn't know what it was. A young officer was in the stateroom behind mine, comes out, looks at me wide-eyed, and using good sailor-like language, asked me, "What the F was that?" And then, like any good trained sailor, he went straight into that cloud, headed toward the danger to find out what had happened.
Man, just like those servicemen on the ground in Beirut, 1983, that bomb goes off. They run to the sound of that explosion. They pick themselves up, go to save as many of their buddies as they possibly can. Same thing at Abbey Gate in August of 2021. Where men and women are killed, U.S. service men and women. And those that are knocked down or hear it from across the airfield, they run to the sound of that explosion, just like your crew. It's absolutely incredible. Did you have a pistol in your wardroom in your office?
So what ended up happening is short answer is yes, but I'll tell you how I get there. As I watched him take off, Lieutenant Jim Salter, I took one step out of my cabin and stopped because I knew we'd been attacked. If it had been a fuel explosion on the ship or the pier, I would have been blown left out into the harbor, being next to a stationary object. I'd been thrust up and right toward the pier, so I knew something on the port side, which is open harbor water, had exploded. So at that point in time, I know that we're under attack. I went back, and right near the head of my bed in the bedroom area is there a safe where I kept the keys to the weapon systems on the ship. There's one emergency light shining on it. I knelt down, dialed it open, and out and grabbed keys to the missiles, the torpedoes, the 5-inch gun, the 20-millimeter close-in weapons. Instead, I've got a Sig Sauer 229 9mm personal weapon I brought with me on deployment. I pulled it out, loaded it, chambered around, decocked it, 2 clips of ammunition in my pocket, out of my cabin, down one deck, ran to the middle of the ship. And as I'm standing there looking toward the back end of the ship, the 3-person watch team that used to be there is gone. A wooden podium has been blown into pieces and is scattered across the deck. Wires that formed our high-frequency radio antenna are snapped off and draped down, and dirty black water is dripping off of everything. And so I'm standing there holding my 9mm, and I'm thinking, well, this may be your destiny, but guess what? You swore that oath, and when you roll out to the port side to find out what's going on, if you see someone that doesn't belong, your job is to make them duck first and don't leave an empty round in the chamber. So with a clip in one hand and the 9mm in the other, that's how I initially headed toward the port side where the blast had gone off.
Wow. And your description of what happens to the ship in Front Burner is, I mean, it's so remarkable. And it stood out to me, one, just for how violent and how thoroughly you describe it, but also because I had last year done research into submarines and where torpedoes go off and what those do to submarines underwater and the tactics involved in anti-submarine warfare and all of that. So I had to go do a deep dive into that and the way you describe the ship and the Boeing of the ship. And it's incredible that these things stay together after taking a hit like that. But your description is I've never read a description quite like it all in one place. It's remarkable. Take us through saving the ship. You grab this pistol, you run out, you're trying to figure out what's going on. You knew immediately you were hit. Did terrorism come into your head right off the bat? Or did you think it could have been something from another foreign country or something like that? Or was it terrorism right away?
We didn't know it was terrorism. I knew we'd been attacked, but we didn't know how or by what. And as I rolled out toward the port side, I see my chief gunner's mate. He's responding with the security teams to reestablish that defensive perimeter around the ship. One of the unique things that had happened is that when the blast went off, it knocked the announcing system for the ship, or what we call the 1MC, where you announce things to the crew. It had knocked it offline. The battery backup for it had failed. The backup system, which is called IVIX, the internal voice communication system, had also failed along with its battery backup. So there was complete silence on the ship. There was no way to tell the crew what had happened, where to go, what to do. And literally in that moment, they fell back on their training. And as I like to say, in a moment of crisis like this, you will fall back to your lowest level of training, but you will rise to your highest level of confidence. Mm. And each one of those sailors knew something bad had happened. They didn't know immediately what it was, but they immediately started showing up to General Quarter Station. One of the unique things I had done, Jack, as I was getting the ship ready for deployment, is I kept raising that bar for the standard of performance. Every time the crew got close, I'd raise it a little bit, and of course, that can really irritate sailors over time. I'm sure you've lived through it during your career. It's like, hey, why is the old man doing this to us? I mean, geez, we are really ready, and now he wants us to do even more. But flashback a little bit, when USS Cole got underway from Norfolk, I had trained the crew so hard and so well that, number one, they were 100% CPR certified. And the morning we got underway from Norfolk, we achieved something that had never been done before in the Navy and has never been repeated since. Our ship got underway with a 100% qualified enlisted crew manning every single watch positions. My officers manned the rail. They didn't stand behind their shoulders looking over them. They manned the rail. And consequently, 2 months later, when we were hit and 20% of the crew was killed and injured, those sailors, when they showed up at General Quarters and people were missing, they not only knew the technical aspects to step up into vacant positions, but they also had the leadership skills as well. So really the crew was responding, and initially they broke out every crew-served weapon: 50 caliber machine guns, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, yes, M14s, 12-gauge shotguns, 9mm pistols, and literally that's the whole ship was now bristling. Every weapon was locked, loaded, safeties off. And if anyone was going to come out, and even the assistant defense attaché tried to come out, and they got guns in their face and they went back to the harbor control until we were sure who was coming out to us. We didn't want anyone getting near the ship for fear of a follow-on attack, because at that point we had figured out, because the two boats had left, one of the security team members had talked to some of the sailors that had been topside, watched what had happened when the boat had come alongside and detonated. And that's how we knew it was, in fact, a terrorist attack at that point. Didn't have confirmation as to who, but obviously a suicide attack is a terrorist attack at that point.
And how did you assess the damage? And when did you think that the ship could sink at any point?
When initially, after seeing the hole in the side with all of the metal shoved inward, the spray pattern of explosive residue, everything on the port side that was metal was slightly dished in, everything that was an electronics enclosure covered with, fiberglass or panels, they'd been blown clean off. I told the chief, don't allow any more boats to come alongside. I went inside the ship up to the bridge initially to see how bad it was. Contacted the Yemeni Port Authority on a handheld bridge-to-bridge walkie-talkie and asked them for three things: freeze all harbor movements since we didn't know where the attack had come from, notify local hospitals, they said they had to, send boats out to us to get the wounded off, because I knew we were going to have wounded beyond our capability to treat. We didn't have a doctor on board. All we had was a chief hospital corpsman who's like a physician's assistant, along with a third-class hospital corpsman and a deck seaman that wanted to learn to be a corpsman. So I knew I was operating inside the golden hour and had to get these wounded sailors off. So I would literally make that call and then reestablish new rules of engagement. I would go down to my cabin, walk toward the back end of the ship in the dark. That's when I got my first piece of good news, because the back 1/3 of the ship had lights on. Right then and there, if I knew I had lights on, I had a generator running, which meant I could get power to pumps, which meant I could save the ship. When I got to that middle of the ship with all that damage, I then literally had to walk through medical. That's where I knew I didn't have a medical team. I didn't know they were live wounded or dead, but they weren't there. The mess decks acts as our mass casualty area because the tables are the perfect width and length to put a wounded sailor on to save them. That's why the back doors of medical open up out onto the mess decks. It's in the dark. And so no one is around. I don't have a casualty area. I get over to the port side. I still can't see the damage. And eventually I would get up into near the galley area. And when I stood there, it is utter devastation. It is just a huge cavern from the force of the explosion. I can look down out the side of the ship. It's over 20 feet deep, the penetration. You could see sunlight. You could hear the water from Aden Harbor lapping in what's left of main engine room number 1, which bore the brunt of the blast. But down in all of that, we have not electrically isolated that part of the ship. We were leaking thousands of gallons of fuel into Aden Harbor. And down in all that fuel, I'm now seeing flashes of light and I'm hearing it's live electrical wires dipping in and out of the fuel. And I'm thinking, not only have we had that devastating explosion, now I'm going to have a major fire on my hands. I have got to get to the central control station, which is co-located with Damage Control Central, so that when you have a fire or flooding or an explosion like this, you want to find out, where is that? How can we stop it? Where's the primary damage? Where's the secondary damage? In our case, control flooding. And that's where I would walk through the darkened mess deck, stepped out, and for the first time in the lighted portion of the ship.
Wow.
And that's where it becomes hard, because on the deck is one of my sailors. And it is very clear from the extent of his injuries that he's dead. And I've got 2 sailors staring down in disbelief. And all I did was walk up. They locked eyes with mine, and they were back in it. And I asked, where's your general quarters station? One said, repair 2, sir, which is or repair 3, sir, which is at the back end of the ship, and he takes off. The other one says repair 2 and goes to take off forward. And I said, wait, I need you to go get some blankets, get our sailor moved here, get our shipmate out of the way. We'll come back and take care of him later. Right now, we need to focus on saving the ship. And then as I rounded the corner, one of the decisions I had made topside in the middle of the ship when I saw the hole in the side is a lot of sailors were coming out, but we didn't know what the security situation was. So I'd shoved them all back inside. Now they're in the remainder and lighted portion of the ship are all of the wounded sailors, 2 to 3 of my other sailors working to stabilize them, shock. Wounds were typical for a blast like this. You had broken bones, shrapnel, cuts, scrapes, and bruises. As the captain, I would have given anything to talk to my wounded sailors, but I can't. Jack, my number one priority has to be the ship, because if we can't save the ship, nothing else is going to matter. And at that point, I had to make that difficult choice. Even after seeing one of my sailors I know is gone, but I step amongst the wounded and I rounded the corner and walked into the central control station to find out how bad's the damage and are we going to be able to save the ship?
Yeah. And you'd been with these guys for a while. You knew each and every one of them. This is it's a big ship, but it's not an aircraft carrier. You knew each and every one of these sailors.
That morning, we had 293 sailors aboard, and I knew every single one of them. And they were doing exactly what we trained to do. Let's face it, you train, you hope, and you pray that you don't have to deal with what we were now dealing with. Yeah. And every single one of them, there was no panic. There was fear, but everyone was staying focused and calm on the job they'd had. When the blast had gone off without anyone telling them, the crew had divided into 1 of 3 groups: damage control to save the ship, triage to save their shipmates, security to stop another attack. Things in many ways, despite all that carnage, everything that was going on, things became very simple. You very quickly were able to prioritize and you start making decisions, and things just begin to roll and happen. And people were taking charge all by themselves. Initially there was no chain of command, and very quickly it reestablished itself as people took charge and began to direct other people what to do from an experience level or from a rank level.
Wow. And I'd never really thought about this before, but the senior ranking medical was a corpsman.
He was chief hospital corpsman. He's like a physician's assistant.
Wow. I guess I never thought about that. I thought a ship like that would have a medical officer, a doctor of some sort, but I never really thought about it. Cause I thought of them, I think of it as a floating city. But I guess I'm thinking about an aircraft carrier or maybe an amphib or something like that. But wow, it kind of does surprise me that that's the senior ranking medical person on the ship is an E7, and now he's in charge of, we got to find him, and he's in charge of triaging this entire scenario.
Absolutely. Now, was I blessed? You bet. And here's why. My command master chief, the senior enlisted on board the ship, was also a hospital corpsman. So while my chief was obviously up on the latest, greatest, and most, technique stuff when it came to being a corpsman, my command master chief, having that experience under his belt, while the chief Doc Mosher, was taking care of all the critically wounded in the midships area, my command master chief at the back end of the ship was getting wounded from out from the inside of the ship, but he was handling a lot of the ambulatory cases and dealing with them back air. And he's back there doing the standard stuff. ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. If anyone needs to do CPR, call me. I'll make sure you're getting it right. And he's running literally from sailor to sailor, saving lives, while the chief hospital corpsman, Doc Mosher, up in the middle of the ship, is also triaging the most critically wounded and prioritizing what they're going to need to do.
Jeez. And I'll jump ahead a little bit now to the night hours, where you get up and you walk through the ship with a flashlight. What was that like?
Well, that first night, the XO and I worked out kind of a trade-off. XO, you take the first half. I'll wake you up middle of the night, and then I'll get some sleep as well. I was too wound up, and I let my XO sleep. I mean, we probably, each of us, had we done that, would have only gotten 3.5 hours sleep at most. And that was really my first opportunity to walk around the ship. And I grabbed a flashlight and I went down and really surveyed the damage below the waterline, around the mess decks, especially in the galley area. It was very difficult. You could see bodies trapped in the wreckage of the galley area itself. We couldn't get down to the entrance to main engine room number 1, where we knew we had some people trapped in the wreckage down there. Once we had gotten the ship stable in a little over an hour, once we had evacuated the wounded off of the ship and into local hospitals in about 99 minutes, at about the 4.5 hour point, we had done a muster. We knew we had 4 killed in action that had been identified, and we had to put into body bags down on the pier. We had 12 missing in the wreckage of the mess line, the galley area, and down in main engine room number 1, but we couldn't tell where they were. But I knew from the dynamics of the blast and the power of the blast that nobody had survived. That would later be confirmed by the medical examiner at Dover Air Force Base, but it was virtually instantaneous for every single one of them. They never knew what hit them. But I just walked around the ship to look at the damage, checked in with the WASP stations, saw how my sailors were doing, talked to them. They were tired. They were sweating it out. The engineers were just absolutely brilliant. My chief engineer, Debbie Courtney, was doing an absolutely phenomenal job. They were already working on systems restoration, and about halfway through the night, they managed to get fresh water restored from the pier coming on board the ship. We had no way to treat it, so we were trying to take precautions to make sure, but at least the next morning, we would have fresh water for the showers back aft. Now, you're dealing with 105-degree temperatures during the day, so telling people to you're going to have a cold shower was not necessarily a bad thing at that point in time. But that's how the engineers were immediately going through systems restoration. No power in the forward 2/3 of the ship. Great. What can we do to get power up there? Let's run casualty power cables. Let's try and get communications up with Radio Central. All those things were going on throughout the entire afternoon, evening, and into the night. We would actually get some Fifth Fleet staff would come aboard right around 10:30 that night. They would ultimately go out in town and get some meals brought back to the ship for the crew to eat. Because as I told the crew, you got to eat and sustain yourselves with this level of effort. You aren't going to survive on Slim Jims and Snickers out of the ship's store. You're going to have to eat real food in order for us to be able to continue to do. And then probably the third big decision I made was, first was save the ship. Second was save the wounded shipmates. The third thing that I thought we needed more than anything else, and I told the defense attaché, was get us water. We initially had no way of getting any water on the ship. We had broken out all the water that we had that we would sell, but that was gone within minutes. And so they started bringing water out to the ship, because I knew no matter how badly the crew wanted to save their ship and shipmates, if I can't keep them hydrated, we're all going to be powering down in that heat from heat exhaustion and eventually heat stroke, and we'd all be worthless.
Yeah. I mean, it's so remarkable, the heroism of the crew. The photos in here that show the damage from inside when you're taking pictures of that are in the book. It's absolutely incredible. When you look back on those, let's say the first 12 hours after this attack, what stands out to you the most?
The one thing that I look at is how the crew reacted. As I when the blast initially went off, I took that split second to look inward to myself and say, okay, no matter what gets brought to you, no matter how bad it may be, you as the captain have to stay perfectly calm. And as I went out of my cabin and I went down to the midships area, up to the bridge, down to the central control station, I'm running into sailors everywhere. There was a sense of focus. There was a sense of calm. And while you could tell people didn't know what was going on and there was fear about what may happen, none of it got out of control. That crew maintained their composure the entire time we were dealing with saving our ship and saving our shipmates. And seeing those sailors do what you expect them to do, that to me is my proudest moment.
Wow. And not too long after, you get a call from President Clinton. Do you remember that call, or is it just something, hey, take this call, go, I have a ship to save here? What was that like, receiving that call?
No, it was vivid. The XO, we had gotten 2 phones aboard the ship, and the XO had one of the phones. And he said, Captain, I've gotten a call from Fifth Fleet. They said the White House is going to call us and to stand by. And a few seconds later, the phone rings, and this is the White House Situation Room. Is this Commander Lippold? Yes, it is. Stand by, sir. We're going to transfer you. And I went through about 4 transfers, and then click, President Clinton's on the line. And we had a very brief discussion about what was going on, because while we knew things had started, President Clinton told me the Middle East was unraveling. When you look back, what had happened the previous week is the Intifada had kicked off in Israel. And I think a lot of people, if you remember back, there was that terrible front page photo on Newsweek that showed that young Palestinian with bloody hands because they had beaten 2 Israeli border guards to death. And so the Middle East is unraveling, and now you have the attack on Cole. Nobody knew how bad it was going to get. And that's where I had to have Saturday morning after I spoke with the president. And I remember that clear as day, because as soon as I was done, I said, XO, stand by, copy this down. And I transcribed word for word what the president and I had discussed so that I could capture it, because they were no longer recording any of those phone calls going in or out of the White House. Thank you, President Nixon and the Watergate tapes, for arranging that cute little one. But that's what I would later learn, part of the reason why. So my XO transcribed it. But the next morning, I had to have that very hard conversation with my crew to say, look, we're in trouble here. It's not just the U.S. The world in the Middle East is in some ways unraveling around us. And while what happened to us is devastating, we may end up not being Fifth Fleet's number 1 priority. And so consequently, we have to be prepared to fend for ourselves if necessary. And I think that's when I really saw the crew, while what had happened to us was obviously impactful, that's when it began to settle in that we may be part of something bigger than just the attack on USS Cole.
Wow. And fairly soon thereafter, NCIS and FBI investigations teams arrive. What do you remember about that, and specifically about FBI Special Agent John O'Neill?
John O'Neill would come aboard several days later. The initial team that came aboard the ship was part of the FEST, which was called the Foreign Emergency Support Team. That's run by the Department of State. They had actually all boarded C-141s out of Andrews Air Force Base and had arrived, had gotten in on Friday, and Saturday morning is when they walked aboard the ship. And the one thing, Jack, that I was very sensitive to do is that regardless of who came aboard that ship, you were there to do one of two things: help me keep that ship afloat, or help me with my crew in sustaining them to be able to live through and deal with what had happened to us. And so everyone that came aboard, I took them on a standard route around the ship. They would come aboard on that starboard aft quarter by the torpedo deck. We would walk up the starboard side by our ribs, or the rigid hull inflatable boats, cross over. I'd show them the blast in the port side, the damage in the area. We'd go to the bow, look back on the ship, go down the starboard side of the ship, go inside. We would walk into the front part of the ship, around through the front passageway, and I would show them the blast area from the forward side and the damage going down to main engine room number 1. Then we'd go back around. I would walk them into the mess decks and show them the damage in the mess line, the mess decks, the port side of the ship. Then we'd walk up into the galley area. I would show them the sailors and where they were trapped. And then we would walk out from there, and we'd walk back out onto the flight deck of the ship and then up to the torpedo deck, because I wanted to give them a sense of where the crew could operate, where they could walk, what we were dealing with and what we were living with. You have to remember that it's a criminal act. So when NCIS or FBI shows up at a crime scene, they're there to do one of two things: recovery and evidence collection. Now they're walking on board a ship, and surprisingly, there was some discussion about, well, we're going to need to preserve the evidence scene, so we're going to make arrangements to get your crew off the ship and out into local hospital or local hotels. And then once we get everything we need for evidence collection, we'll let them back aboard the ship. No, that isn't how this is going to work.
Wow.
We are going to be respectful, given that what had happened in that area, and that we still had our shipmates that were there. We will help you with the evidence collection team. And just as a quick aside, I have to tell this one little story that literally less than 30 minutes after the blast, my master at arms, first class petty officer, Justin Crow, is looking down, and he's watching people start to clean up in the area that would become the midships triage area where Doc Mosier would work, and realizes they're tampering with evidence, tells them stop, has the presence of mind to go down to his office, grab evidence collection bag, gloves, go down, start collecting unique shaped pieces of the boat, the fin off the outboard motor, although we didn't know what it was. We initially thought it was a missile fin that might have been shot from ashore. He was collecting parts of the bombers. We had a tooth embedded in a mooring line. We had pieces of bone and flesh all over the top side. He collects all that in separate evidence bags, keeps it under lock and key, under guard. And when the FBI arrives aboard, he hands them that box that's now logged in on what they call the 302s, which are the evidence documentation. And that serves as now to go after al-Nashiri. But back on the ship, all these things are going on, and the crew is just, they're dealing with it, they're responding with it, they're working through it. And FBI and NCIS came aboard. When they first heard about the blast, they thought, okay, a 1-foot hole in the side of the ship, no big deal. We'll get a little bit of evidence and call it a day. They get out to the ship and they kind of look at that top half, which is about 25% of the whole. And they think, boy, this is a little bigger than I thought it would be. When I walked that first agent into the galley area and he looked around, he would later tell me the only thing he could think of is, how can I possibly convey back to Washington the sheer magnitude of what has happened and what this crew has done to save their ship and shipmates?
Wow. And EOD arrives at some point, and they go beneath the water, and they're the first people to see it and assess the damage from that perspective. What was that? What did you learn when they came aboard and did their dive.
Well, when they did it, we were very fortunate because we actually had a demining team in country. Yemen had undergone a very violent civil war. The North and South Yemen at the time had merged into one country, now Yemen, in 1994, but there were mines throughout the country. And what we were doing is we were helping them with a demining team there to try and make the country safe for people. In other words, where the mines had been placed, how do we now go out there, find the mines, de-arm the mines, destroy the mines, so that we can once again try and make it a safe country for everyone that's there. And what would end up happening is those guys were all EOD. So they would end up actually coming out to the ship with one of their ribs, do a dive, and that's where we learned that cracks went to within 18 inches of the keel. They looked at how big the blast hole was under the water, the deformation of the hull itself, and whether it looked like it. Fortunately, when they did that, the number one thing we learned was the keel is intact. And while it may have flexed a lot, it did not bend to a point that it was breaking. It did not damage. The blast had not broken our back, because when we pulled in that morning, we were drawing about 32 foot 6 inch of water. We were next to a pier with about 36 inches of water, or 36 feet of water. So what happens is when that blast went off, it was not a shape charge like you also may have incorrectly read in some of the reports, but water doesn't compress. So the downward force of that blast hitting the seabed literally blew a 20-foot wide, 4-foot deep crater underneath USS Cole. And the reflection of that blast off the seabed is what would lift the ship up that estimated 6 to 8 feet before we settled back down in the water. Even with all that, the keel held solid.
Wow. Jeez. And you don't feel like you have to comment on this, but people can read it because it is in the book. You do get a visit from General Franks. And I thought it was really illuminating because of similar experiences, I guess one could say, that speak to a disconnect between tactical level leadership in situations and I guess more strategic level politics.
So Tommy Franks at the time was on a country visit and was in the desert, learns that we've been attacked and that we've got 5 sailors dead, 12 are missing in the wreckage, and he takes days before he comes out to the ship. No communication, no direction, no press releases, nothing. He kind of treated it like, hey, this is a Navy issue. It's a bad thing. Therefore, I'm a senior officer. I want nothing to do with it. Very politically safe. When he did come out to the ship, it was like he was totally disconnected from the reality that we have. The same route that I'd walked that first FBI agent on board as the on-scene commander when he arrived, I took General Franks through. And the entire time he's walking around, he's handing out coins, gripping and grinning the crew, telling them what a great job they're doing. And he ends up at the back end of the ship, leaves. And I looked at my XO and I said, that general had absolutely no clue what we've been through or what we've done. On the way out, he handed me a bag of 30 coins and make sure you hand these out to your crew. That bag of 30 coins is still sitting in my attic. So the disconnect, like you alluded to, between that combatant commander, who certainly had no empathy, no understanding, and no connection to what we had accomplished with my crew of heroes, was, to me, stunning. And I know you gave me the out not to talk about it, but it's too important, because I don't care whether you're in Washington or whether you're at a major command at a headquarters somewhere. You have to understand what these young men and women like you do and go through when they order them forward to do God's work for our nation that keeps us safe here at home.
Yeah. And can you describe how the Cole got back to the United States, the Blue Marlin, and what that looks like? And I mean, to me, it looked like a feat of engineering, just incredible.
It was absolutely amazing, Jack. I mean, within a few days after the blast, we had learned there was this large, heavy lift ship called the Blue Marlin that was in port in the Middle East because it had just finished delivering 3 minesweepers into the Middle East because we were very fearful that Iran might mine the Strait of Hormuz, and we wanted to have the capability in theater to be able to respond should they do that in an attempt to shut down the world's oil supply. But it had no follow-on tasking. So the engineers immediately set about, because a ship like Blue Marlin, what they're really designed to do is the giant oil rigs that you see down in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, that's what those ships are designed to actually transport and take out. So they can take a mammoth load, but now it's how do you take a warship and put it on the docking blocks that you would normally see in a dry dock and put that on the ship. And then how do we position it? Where do we position it? How do we get it just right? And so all these engineers are coming aboard the ship and they're measuring and checking and figuring out. They would weld this kind of, if the only way I could describe it is if you took a old locomotive where you had the cowcatcher on front, they welded one of those on the side of the ship, but facing back toward the stern, and the front's got a flat edge with wood on it. And then they welded these 2 large poles onto the deck of Blue Marlin, because Blue Marlin, what it actually does is there's 4 anchors, one port and starboard up by the bow and one port and starboard off the stern. And they would literally pay those out, moving the ship around to go into what they call a 4-point moor. And then they sink down about 60 feet deep. And then a ship or these oil derricks would literally, they floated over the top, and then they raised Blue Marlin back up, getting rid of all the water in the tanks that they took on, deballasting. And that's where they had all these docking blocks for USS Cole put on there. We were positioned near these 2 large poles that are on the port side, and it would gently lift us up and out of the water. We're cocked off at a 17.5-degree angle. And you look at the one picture, it's in the book. The reason we're cocked off is because the deepest part of the ship in modern day destroyers and cruisers are not the propellers, but actually the sonar dome up forward. That's where it draws that 32-foot 6-inch that we pulled into that day. And you can see the rubber window where we ping and listen for submarines, but that's literally hanging off the back edge of Blue Marlin as we get lifted up and out of the water. And then they would, we would secure the ship. They would weld some braces in place, but that's how they would bring the ship down around the Horn of Africa, up through the South Atlantic, into the Gulf of Mexico, back to the shipyard that built it, which was Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi.
Incredible. And this shouldn't surprise me, I guess, but it did. Maybe that's just, I don't know, some optimistic outlook on my part. But talk with me a little bit about the ambassador evidence collection, having to turn over that husbanding agent's cell phone. What happened to that? What happened to that evidence? What was that like to deal with a country team or an ambassador in the midst of this investigation?
Well, it was a little unique. When the blast had gone off, the logistics agent for the port, or what we call the husbanding agent, was actually aboard the ship. So not knowing what role he may or may not have had in this whole thing, I took him under custody. I was told I needed to release him. My response back to the embassy personnel was, I'll release him when the Marines get here. They said, no, you're under orders. You have to release him. I said, I'm not releasing him. And we'd also we'd taken his satchel into custody. We had searched through it. His cell phone was in there. That's probably my one regret, Jack, is that I really didn't understand the role that cell phones could play. And so consequently, had I known that, I would not have given him his satchel. And when word came down from the embassy through the ambassador that we are to release him, that's when I deferred. And I'll touch on the ambassador in just a sec. But when we turned him over and let him off the ship that evening, I would return the cell phone to him. Greatest regret. The FBI never found anything in the investigation that tied him either directly or indirectly to Al-Qaeda in that port. But that phone would have just confirmed his innocence, which I think he would have needed. Now, regarding the ambassador, I had a unique connection that most people didn't know about. I had mutual friends, both Ambassador Bodine and I, we had Thanksgiving dinner together over multiple years. I had Christmas dinner at her house when she was sworn in as the ambassador to Yemen. I was actually working for the secretary at the time, Secretary of the Navy Dalton. I went over to State Department, up to the 7th floor. I witnessed her swearing in. So the morning after the blast, both the ambassador and Fifth Fleet came aboard the ship. And I gave them the same tour that I've described, whether it was FBI, Tommy Franks, they also got that same route. It was a standard route. And at the end, the ambassador just asked the admiral if she could have a moment alone, and Fifth Fleet walked away. And that's when the ambassador just looked at me and said, "How are you doing?" And I very kindly, I said, "Okay, up until now, you're the ambassador. Now you're Barbara." And I said, "Barbara, you can't ask me that question." I said, "I'm doing fine, but I need to focus on my ship and my crew. I'll deal with everything that's going on in my head when I get back and I've got time to think about it. But right now, I've got to stay focused on this. So while I appreciate you asking that question, please don't ask it again."
Yeah. And what did you learn? Have you learned since, even writing this book, which came out in 2012, about the targeting of the USS Cole, the planning, who was behind it?
The planning for the attack itself was really Al-Qaeda. Within days after the blast, with the FBI not only on the ship, recovering my fallen sailors from inside the wreckage, but also they were recovering evidence that they needed to make sure they collected, more pieces of boat, more pieces of bomber, trying to confirm through DNA who they were, where they were, bits and pieces of fibers from the carpet that lined the boat that would eventually be tributed back to the safe house. All these little things are being done, but another team is out in town and they're going through the safe houses and other areas trying to find that. And they're collecting all of this evidence. And what would happen is the footprint for the FBI began to become larger and larger. And the ambassador was getting more and more irritated because when John O'Neill had walked aboard, I mean, John's a great guy. I mean, he came aboard. He is a larger than life character. That PBS special that's out there called The Man Who Knew, I commend everyone to watch that because it truly does capture. And he was out there to solve yet another Al-Qaeda attack on U.S. interests. And when he came aboard, he walked around that ship. He was in charge. Everybody knew it. We would have director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, would come aboard the ship. They would all walk around. When Director Freeh was aboard, obviously the ambassador was back aboard the ship at that point. So we had a lot of distinguished visitors, so to speak, aboard the ship. From my perspective as the captain, I gave them the due respect to their rank. But again, I boiled it down to two things. Every single person that came aboard that ship, regardless of your rank or stature or level in our government, you were either helping me keep that ship afloat and sustaining my crew, or I didn't want you aboard the ship. And I knew that the FBI and NCIS team were doing a phenomenal job. I knew that the ambassador was doing things. Word would begin to come my way over time, though, that there was a lot of friction between John O'Neill and the ambassador in what needed to be done to safeguard our ship. And then I think, unfortunately, you saw over time where the ambassador appeared to be more concerned with representing Yemeni interests to the U.S. government rather than U.S. government interests to the Yemenis people. And that would remain a bone of friction even up to today.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, John O'Neill was killed on 9/11 in the World Trade Center. Man. Now, when I read the part of the book about the investigation, the Navy side, I thought it happened pretty fast. I don't know why I thought that. I haven't been involved in that many investigations, but I guess I would have thought before I read the book that something of this magnitude would take a long time to investigate and come to findings and all the rest. But it seemed to happen from the outside looking in quickly. There was also the USS Cole Commission report. There's a whole bunch of investigations, of course, what's going to happen with you, your promotion, and all the rest of it, and then a leaking of classified information to the Washington Post on December 9th. That is just, you're only a couple months out from this thing. Take me through that.
Well, Jack, there were two investigations on regarding the attack on USS Cole. One was what they call a JAGMAN investigation, which is a Judge Advocate General Manual investigation. It is done under guidelines provided under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And what it does, it is supposed to be what they call a finding of fact. In other words, it investigates and determines what are all the facts surrounding this situation so that the investigation that then go to an adjudicating authority who makes a determination. Has there been any malfeasance? Has there been any willful misconduct? Or is everything done the way it's supposed to? Do we want to charge anybody? Do we want to, could I have been charged with 17 counts of negligent homicide because the boat got alongside? Or did the crew somehow fail because we didn't do all the security measures we could have done that morning? And so you had that investigation going, and it looked at the actions of the commanding officer and crew, period. Then you had this Cole Commission report, which is a larger overarching Department of Defense investigation that really looked into, hey, we're moving units around the world in the Department of Defense, ships, aircraft, submarines, troops, helicopters, jets. What is the force protection posture for those? How are we determining it? Because when you really look at the Department of Defense and each of the services have got these force protection measures that they tell you to do, but they don't really tell you, well, what are the procedures you need to do to follow it? What is the equipment you need to do it? What is the training you need to have to exercise the procedures and the equipment? What are the rules of engagement that allow you to do it? And at the end of the day, what's ultimately the intelligence that's driving it? What was interesting is there was no investigation into anyone above me in the chain of command. The other one looked at it from a Department of Defense perspective. The other one was a true investigation to look at what had the crew and I done and were charges merited. Nobody above me was questioned into why was that ship into that port? What was the intelligence that they were given on board? What were the security measures that could and could not have been done? And so consequently, you had an entire chain of command that never got looked at. And unfortunately, that would start to put us on that path toward 9/11.
How about the leaking of classified information to the Washington Post?
Oh, boy. So the investigation when it was going on was classified secret, no foreign. So it was classified secret, which meant that if any of it was to be leaked, it would cause grave danger to the United States because of the size of the blast, the damage it had caused, how the sailors had been killed. All that was classified. No foreign means that we're not even going to share this outside of the U.S. government, not even with our closest allies. And so when that investigation worked its way up through the chain and the officer that completed it then turned it over to the Fifth Fleet commander, he would make what they call the first endorsement on it before he would send it back to the United States to the commander-in-chief of the Atlantic Fleet, who'd be the next investigation. That investigation was sent, and 2 days later, large pieces of that investigation appeared in the Washington Post. And at that point in time, I knew I'm being set up because this gets out and gets leaked to the Washington Post with the level of fidelity that was in it. And thank goodness I had a Naval Academy classmate that was a public affairs officer to the chief of naval operations. And I basically expressed to him, if this is how the Navy handles classified information, no wonder 17 of my sailors are now dead with a hole in the side of my ship because you can't even keep that information away from terrorists. Of course, they're going like, oh, that is not how this is supposed to work. Hey, take a deep breath here. And I'm like, no, this is a setup. This leak is designed in order to put me on the hot plate and frame it in the eyes of the American public that I'm to blame for allowing this attack to happen. And I wasn't about to brook that. And I basically said, you can either figure out how to stop the leaks or my press conference that I'm going to hold. And oh, by the way, you kind of learn how to play hardball. If you're going to do a report where you don't want the American public to pay attention to it, you release it on a Friday evening. Just watch that in politics sometime here in Washington.
Very common.
Yep. And so consequently, when do you want to release a report? Bright and early Monday morning, because then it gets to bounce all week long as people learn about it and the press starts to question what's really happening. And they basically said, we will get this stopped. And to the Navy's credit, the leaks did stop. But it was that initial, and I don't know who it was, and I've never put my finger on it. I have my own personal suspicions that I'll keep close to my vest. But the reality of it is the leaks stopped, which to me was the most important thing, because I did not want any of that bad press to reflect on the heroism of my crew. Because the way I looked at it is, hey, if you want someone accountable, there's one accountable officer on board a Navy ship, and that's the captain, period. And that accountable officer was me. If you want responsibility for what happened, hey, that's a bearded guy that we hunted down to Abbottabad, Pakistan, shot in the face, stuffed in a body bag with weight, and he's now in the middle of the ocean. And if you want blame, that was two suicide bombers that blew themselves up and put themselves in little pieces all over the top side of my ship. So when people want to try and blame me for allowing that boat to get alongside, I'm going to give them pushback, because my crew of heroes, look, as the accountable officer, look at how they performed before, during, and after that event. That ship is still out there today defending freedom because of them. And they saved their shipmates, because that first day, Jack, we evacuated 33 wounded off the ship in 99 minutes. And of those 33, when they got into local hospitals and with a French medical team flowing in to work on them, 32 of them would survive.
Wow. In the days, weeks, months after the attack, were you frustrated with the lack of U.S. response? Did you expect a U.S. response, an attack on a U.S. warship? Or did you look back to Khobar Towers and Kenya and Tanzania and more recent history? Or did you hop back to 1983 and really a lack of U.S. response after the both the embassy bombing and then the Beirut headquarters and barracks Marine bombing? Did you expect the U.S. to respond, and were you frustrated?
I absolutely did. I thought there would be something. But what ended up happening is we were in port for 17 days. We would then get loaded onto USS Tarawa. That would take a couple, 3 days to get us up the coast, fly us into Oman, then to Germany, then back stateside. We got back in early November, but unfortunately, 5 days after USS Cole crew comes home to a hero's welcome in Norfolk, Virginia, that attack literally fell off the front pages, because the nation became consumed with Gore v. Bush and hanging chads. And so consequently, everyone was wondering who's going to be the president. We weren't being paid attention to. And what ultimately would happen is you had President Clinton kept raising the bar with the CIA and others to confirm that this was absolutely proof positive, 100% bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Well, you're never going to get on 100% in any intelligence you do. And in the same token, so consequently, the Clinton administration kept raising the bar, and they walked out of office on January 20th, and no response. By the same token, you had the Bush administration come into office, and they kind of looked at it as, hey, that happened on the last watch. We're forward looking, not backward acting. So they didn't want to do anything, because they took an attitude of, hey, if it had been important, the Clinton administration would have started something and we would have finished it. Unfortunately, Cole was looked at more like political baggage than an attack on a Navy ship that had caused $250 million of damage, killed 17 and wounded 37, and there was no response. So very frustrating at the beginning of the year, with an investigation still going on and not released to the public yet. And I'm watching, and you're right, Jack, I began to reflect and think back. What were the responses to the Beirut embassy bombing, the Beirut headquarters and barracks bombing? When I look back at World Trade Center 1, there was an arrest. Khobar Towers, hardly anything. The embassy bombings, virtually nothing. The United States had unfortunately established a well-worn path of not responding to terrorist attacks, because our government had started to take a look as, well, that's just the price we're willing to pay to be a leader on the global stage. But Americans pay that price. Families pay that price. And it's my belief today that no, you're a terrorist attack, you kill Americans. We're going to do one of two things. We're going to hunt you down and capture you and hold you accountable, or we're going to kill you, period. There should be no middle ground. And if it means that we have to hold governments accountable, then we need to do it. It is time for the United States to step up and become a world leader again and not cower behind these laws that were written to safeguard someone future board of directors membership rather than actually doing what's necessary to keep our country safe.
Yeah. And this is from the book. Apparently, even bin Laden was frustrated by the long inaction after the attack on Cole, according to the 9/11 Commission's final report. In February 2001, a source reported that an individual whom he identified as the big instructor, probably a reference to bin Laden, complained frequently that the United States had not yet attacked. According to the source, bin Laden wanted the United States to attack, and if it did not, he would launch something bigger. That paragraph stood out to me.
Certainly did. And I remember writing it very well.
Yeah.
And, you know, there were just some moments as I sat out there in my apartment back in Carson City, Nevada, where I'd grown up. And I'm sure you experienced it as well in writing Beirut. You just have those moments as you write of ethical and moral clarity that just allow you to put words onto paper that really hit home the seriousness of the business we're in.
Yeah. And further, this is a little farther on, but as the 9/11 Commission staff later reported, the new team at the Pentagon did not push for a response for the Cole. According to the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, his deputy, Wolfowitz told us that by the time the new administration was in place, the Cole incident was stale. The 1998 cruise missile strikes showed UBL and Al-Qaeda that they had nothing to fear from a U.S. response, Wolfowitz said. For his part, Rumsfeld also thought too much time had passed. He worked on the force protection recommendations developed in the aftermath of the USS Cole attack, not response options. Clark, in his book, recalled watching limousines head back to the Pentagon after a White House meeting on Cole just after the attack with his State Department counterpart, Mike Sheehan. What's it going to take, Dick? Sheehan demanded. Does Al-Qaeda have to attack the Pentagon to get their attention? Once again, that one stood out. Incredible. And then there's this long section here that I was going to read, but I think I'll have people just pick up the book here. It's in the epilogue on page 299 after that paragraph that I just read. And just remarkable. Everyone needs to pick up this book. There's so many lessons in here. I did want to ask a few more things before I know I've gone over time, but
my time's your time. So long as you want to go, long as you want to go, Jack.
Too kind. After this, in the aftermath of this attack, you're dealing with the politics. There's no response. You're figuring out what to do next, personally, professionally. Where do you go? Where do you go next?
Well, when all this was going on, number one, the one thing that I thought was unique, even with the investigation going on, is I felt it was a duty of mine as the commanding officer to reach out to the families. And initially, as you would expect from any large bureaucracy, the first and easy answer is always going to be no. And I kind of looked at that when I approached the Navy in December of 2000 as good. We've got a starting point for negotiations. And I approached them a couple more times, and to their credit, the Navy eventually said yes, and I would get on the road with my command master chief for about 6 to 8 weeks. And I traveled around the country with him and visited the families of the 17 sailors. And in each of those cases, whether I was met at the front door with open arms or outright hostility, I was able to share what the failures were, that we didn't have information and intelligence or force protection measures. I learned more about each of my sailors than I ever knew, because families would hand me family photo albums, wedding albums, funeral programs. And I felt blessed, Jack, that having been in command 15 months when we were hit, I was able to tell a story about each and every one of those 17 sailors who had been killed. And for a few brief minutes, I could bring that sailor back to life in the eyes of their family. And that to me meant more than anything I had ever done before in my life and ever done since. And at the end, we would have the change of command. My relief would say those three great words, I relieve you. I would eventually go on, and I served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 3.5 years. In a unique twist of irony, I reported to the Pentagon in July of 2001, and the world changed 6 weeks later. The office I would in would ultimately be working detainee policy for 3 years, and I had a hand in that. So if you ever see me walking around, despite the tragedy, with a slight grin on my face, it's called karma, and there's a reason for it. And I thoroughly enjoyed doing that work in creating that policy to handle these terrorist detainees. Then I would work on the Navy staff for international strategy. And then eventually, as we mentioned, being in the military is not a job for life. And eventually you retire and move on. And I consider myself, despite what happened on Cole, to be leading an incredibly blessed life where I can still keep the story of my heroes alive in the eyes of the American public, but also give back to those businesses and those other people out there by sharing the story, not only of heroism, but of leadership, of crisis management, of how to deal with people in very tenuous times like this, and what it really means to be a leader, which is it's not about you, it's about them and how you engage with them every single minute of every single day, because you're not establishing your legacy. You want to build them up to establish their own legacies for the future of our country.
Oh, exactly. I looked at every opportunity as one to every interaction as an opportunity to build trust with those down the chain of command and up the chain of command for that matter. And I always wanted people who worked under me to do the job better than I was doing it for them. That was always my goal. And what happened to those that were eventually found to be involved in the attack on the Cole?
Eventually, there would be one captured, al-Nashri, who is down in Guantanamo Bay today, still being held for a military commission that's dragged on far too long, with justice delayed is justice denied. But we're hopeful we'll get to a trial late in 2025. You had another guy, al-Harithi. He was the recipient of the first armed predator strike following the war breaking out post 9/11. That's when the agency tracked him down and took him out. Another guy, al-Badawi, would be captured by the Yemenis. They would not extradite him for trial. They would sentence him to death. He would go to prison. He would escape. They would recapture him. He'd be sentenced to life. He escaped. They'd recapture him. And essentially, he was on house arrest in the 2018 timeframe. And I mean, I literally did a speech late 2018, and I said, just kind of describing who these three principal characters were and what had happened to each of them. And I said, look, all I can hope is that al-Badawi gets comfortable enough with his surroundings that he leaves the comfort of the capital of Sana'a, where we cannot strike him, and that once out of town, we'll take care of business. And God love it. He would go out, and on January 1st, 2019, he would be in a car. He had been involved in operational planning of terrorist acts again in the country of Yemen and elsewhere. He was re-engaging with Al-Qaeda, and we took him out with another Predator missile with one of those Ninja. And, we do work that needs to be done, and that's all we need to say about it. So 2 of them were taken care of by strikes. One's getting ready to stand trial next year in a capital case, and we're looking forward to holding him accountable.
Wow. Now, what did you learn from CIA officer Charles Allen, and what time and date did you visit him at Langley, CIA headquarters?
Sure. Well, when I had been on USS Shiloh, just to go back a little bit, as the executive officer, my commanding officer on there, a guy named John Russack, great guy, he would come back to Washington following his assignment retired out of the Navy, and got hired as the executive assistant to Charlie Allen, who, in a very modest title, is the assistant director for collections for the CIA. So when you think about what the CIA collects around the world, this is the guy in charge of it. So pretty big scope of responsibility here. And when I got back to DC in July of 1 and reported to the Joint Staff, John Resac called me up and said, "Hey, Mr. Allen would love to have you come up and really share with you what the agency knew before, during, and after the hit on your ship, and kind of build that picture for you." So I said, "Great." We fenced some dates, hopped in the car, drove up the George Washington Parkway, talked to the nice camera at the entrance to the CIA, pulled up, talked to the nice, well-armed, outfitted guard between the barrier gates. He gives me a pass to the VIP parking in front of the old headquarters building. I get out and walk in. It is just like, I mean, it was real life, but it was like a movie, because in the center floor is the huge seal of the CIA. To my left is the single gold star embedded in the wall for the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. To the right is the Wall of Honor with row of gold stars. And I go over and look at the book, some named, some for only known to God and the agency. And John would come down, pick me up. We'd go up to his office. And then we'd go into Charlie Allen's office around 7 o'clock that morning. We would sit down, and for an hour and a half, he briefed me on what they knew about bin Laden and what he had been doing. And that goes back to World Trade Center 1, to the embassy bombings, and then the attack on USS Cole, and what they were doing to try and track him down around the world. And after an hour and a half, it was all over. And Mr. Allen said, "Well, what do you think?" And I'll never forget. I looked at him, Jack, and I said, "Sir, first, I greatly appreciate your time. I know how valuable it is because John's always telling me about it. But second, America doesn't understand. I believe it is going to take a seminal event, probably in this country, where hundreds, if not thousands, die before Americans realize we are at war with this guy," meaning bin Laden. And he said, "Well, we're doing our best to make sure that doesn't happen." And we got up, we walked out of his office. We were going to look at some overhead satellite imagery of what now is commonly known, but back then was very closely guarded, which was Tarnak Farms, the major training camp for Al-Qaeda operatives. And 20 minutes after I said that, the first plane hit the North Tower. And like everyone else, we're kind of looking at the TV screens that we're seeing throughout the building, wondering, I'm thinking, what idiot sightseeing plane on a crystal clear fall day could run into one of the twin towers instead of paying attention to where he should have been flying? And we were literally standing outside the counterterrorism center to go meet then the director, which was Cofer Black, when the second plane hit. And that's when everybody knew that we were under attack. And intuitively, everybody knew it was probably Al-Qaeda. And at that point in time, we went back up to Mr. Allen's office. He shooed everyone out, put his arm around me and says, "Kirk, I can't believe you said what you did this morning." And I said, "Well, I guess it's just a hard lesson that everyone's going to learn about today, but I need to get back down to the Pentagon because clearly we're going to have a very busy day ahead of us." I would leave, hop in my car, drive down. I ultimately would get down there to find the Pentagon had been attacked. I parked up on the main artery that goes in and out of the south side of Washington, D.C., 395. And I would be up there with Arlington County Police and the Virginia State Highway Patrol. And we were literally commandeering buses. I was trying to calm down parents because at that time, the Child Development Center was attached to the Pentagon, make sure they knew their kids were safe. But ultimately, it was that conversation that I had with Charlie Allen that keeps reverberating in my head, because I guess I just knew it was going to happen. And unfortunately, it did on 9/11.
Wow. I was thinking about you because I was there about a week and a half after we did our event outside of Annapolis there. And we got to film for the new TV show in that lobby at the agency. And I'd been through there before under different auspices, of course, and in the military. But now back filming there. But it was so powerful to be there and see that wall again, to know some of those stories behind some of the stars that are in the book that don't have names attached. To go to the museum, and it was really humbling to be able, and such an honor to be able to film there in that lobby. It wasn't something we took lightly for the show. That's for sure. So what are you doing now? And are you talking to are you still going to Annapolis? Are you talking to the students there, leadership wise? What do you pass along to people that are thinking about joining the military, or that are at the service academies, or just starting their career in the profession of arms?
Well, I get a great opportunity. When I retired, as I mentioned, I went into the world of inspirational leadership speaking. I went with a bureau, Kepler Speakers. You can look them up online. And I literally have been doing that now for 17 years. Obviously, when COVID hit, I'm probably like you, Jack. I don't do idle time well. So I'm always looking for something to do, something to be engaged in, something for my mind to be actively working on at all times. So when COVID hit, nobody needs speakers because who's holding conferences? I said, okay, let's pick up the phone, called the Naval Academy, called the leadership department and said, what does it take to become an adjunct professor? And they're like, seriously? You want to do that? I said, absolutely. It's a great way to give back. You've got the future there. How can I help? And I would become an adjunct professor for a course that was called Ethics and Moral Reasoning for Naval Leaders. And that course, in some ways, was mandated congressionally as an outgrowth to teach all the members of the service academies, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, because of what had happened in Abu Ghraib with some of the ethical failings that we had there as a military. This course was created, and as an adjunct professor, it's our job to take what the philosophers teach for ethics and morals and now apply it to real world cases. And it's taught to the youngsters, again, those sophomores that are there. It's a semester long course. So for 16 weeks, I had the honor and privilege over 2 semesters to teach them. I still go back and substitute occasionally with 2 great friends of mine that, retired flag officers that are teaching there today. But it was a way to give back and also stay busy. And as we came out of COVID and got working again, I'm back doing the speeches for businesses around the country, sharing the story of my heroes. So I love it. And, I'm probably not going to retire doing it, because if you do what you love, and why would anyone want to stop me from doing it?
Yeah, I hear you. In the last few minutes we have here, who's the USS Cole named for?
USS Cole is named after Sergeant Darrell S. Cole, United States Marine Corps. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for heroic actions on the first day of Iwo Jima. When he had initially joined the Marine Corps, they discovered that he could play the French horn from band in high school. And they felt that bands were a big morale booster for the troops. So they would not allow him to be just an infantryman and go. And he took time and kept hounding them. And finally they said, okay. And he would eventually end up out in the Pacific and ultimately on Iwo Jima. And that first day, he would take a satchel full of grenades and charge one machine gun nest and come back and get more grenades, a second machine gun nest and come back and get more grenades, a third machine gun nest. And it was on his way back from the third one that he was unfortunately killed in action. And his family, I still stay in touch with some of them today, the distant relatives, because he wasn't married and had kids, but members of his family still come to the Cole services, the memorial services on seminal events like the 20th. And so it's a great tribute that ship was named after a Marine Corps hero, which, personally having come that close to becoming a Marine myself before I chose surface warfare, I just have always held it special. And as another point, when each of my sailors were recovered and we identified them, and a flag was draped over the body bag, and our crew members walked them off the ship in an honor ceremony. When they went ashore into Yemen, they were under 24/7 Marine guard until they began that journey home to their families.
You do take some time in the book also to talk about parallels between the Indianapolis and the Cole, and I wonder if you could touch on some of those for us.
Sure. This is a little bit hard. I mean, one of the things that came out in the book when I wrote it is initially it was 512 pages. A lot of people right after the incident had advised me to, you need to retire, write a book, get on the speaking circuit, and make $1 million. Well, as you and I both know, unless you're a guy like Marcus Luttrell, lone survivor, that isn't going to happen. And I think what also people didn't realize is I was no more ready to relive that onto paper than Fly to the Moon. And it took me 10 years before I would write it. During that time, I began to gain a better perspective on history. And I would have a lot of people that gave me a lot more detail and information that allowed me to write a much more thorough and much more rich history of what the crew and I had accomplished during those dark minutes, hours, and days after the attack. But it also reflected that when it was all said and done, the investigation into the sinking of the USS Indianapolis was, again, they looked at the actions of the commanding officer and crew, and ultimately they would court-martial Captain McVeigh, who is the commanding officer of Indianapolis, for not using evasive maneuvers to try and avoid torpedoes had they been shot at him. Even though during the court-martial, they would bring in the commanding officer of the submarine that torpedoed the Indianapolis, which, oh, by the way, they had just finished delivering all the component parts for the atomic bombs that would be used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That commanding officer of the Japanese submarine said, I still would have been able to hit it. Torpedo evasive maneuvers do not make a difference to me. I can predict where they're probably going to go, and if I'm close enough, my torpedoes are going to hit. They nonetheless would court-martial him, and he would live out his days with the disgrace of that court-martial hanging over his head. And unfortunately, in the 1960s, he would eventually go stand out on the balcony of his home and would commit suicide. And while I never would do anything like that, it was the parallel where somehow the system turned on him rather than understanding the full ramifications of what had happened. Because again, sailors had brutally been killed in the Pacific waters by sharks and had been eaten alive, and it was horrific. There was this institutional kind of signal and demand that there must be someone held responsible for what happened, without understanding, as I've mentioned previously, what that word accountability really stands for.
Yeah. Did you find writing front burner? Did you find writing it therapeutic?
Believe it or not, Jack, I did not. For me, it was incredibly painful to relive it.
I thought that's what you'd say, actually.
I'm incredibly grateful to the number of people who, as I mentioned, shared things with me to really write that out. One of the demands I made, and I will say, is that in that book, every quote that someone else made came from an interview. In that interview, I was insistent, whether it was with Ambassador Bodine, Vice Admiral Moore, Secretary of the Navy Danzig, Admiral Natter, in charge of Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, I put a tape recorder on the table and turned it on. And they all agreed to do that because 10 years later, they realized that I was going to write a book to capture history. Mm-hmm. I wasn't going to write a book to grind an axe. And therein lies the difference, because I felt I had an obligation to my crew and the families to catch the heroism of what they had done, what we had endured, and that they were back out there today, still members of our society and of the military, continuing to keep us a great nation.
Yeah.
I mean, the family suffered an unimaginable loss. And I wanted to make sure that the American public understood in front burner that I felt that loss. My crew still feels that loss, as do I. But we will never forget those 17 sailors that paid the ultimate price for our freedom.
Well, you have my utmost respect for everything you've done for this nation, how you handled things on the day of the attack, for how you captured those lessons in here in this, what is a history. And I suspected that you would not say that it was therapeutic to write after reading this book. A lot of people, after I read books about traumatic events, will say that it is. But for some reason, after reading this, I knew you'd answer the exact way that you did. But thank you for writing this. Thank you for the way that you waited these 10 years, that you really put this thought into here. You can tell this is a very thoughtful book, and for the way you carry yourself today and represent yourself, the Navy, and the nation. So thank you so much for everything. And thank you for your friendship as well.
Well, thank you, Jack. It's wonderful to be your friend as well. And thank you for what you've also been given the opportunity to do with Beirut, to capture that piece of our nation's history that, like us, was untold for far too long before you finally got it into print to show the real heroism following that terrorist attack in Beirut at the barracks and headquarters, and what those Marines did to get their fellow Marines out of there alive.
Yeah, it really was. That was a surprise to me, because I just knew the attack. You hear those numbers. You hear 241 servicemen died. And then that's almost the extent of it. What you don't realize is that there is this tremendous rescue effort in the wake of that bombing that is one of the greatest rescue stories in modern military history. Just remarkable what those guys were doing with their bare hands, with K-bar knives, maybe a shovel or a crowbar. But front burner right here, everyone needs to add this to their library, certainly. And Park Books, right outside of Annapolis, we'll have signed ones. So be sure and contact Park Books to get a signed one right here. And thank you again for everything. Hopefully we can link up again in person soon.
Absolutely. Love to do that.
All right. Take care. Thanks for everything.
You bet, Jack.
If you enjoyed this clip, click here to watch the full episode, or click here to watch another clip from the podcast.